Russian is sort of like a combined instrument of both military and economic, political, and ideological and cultural domination. It's a certain kind of an instrument that includes all of those things. But what its purpose is in every case is the efficient extraction of wealth and its repatriation to metropolitan economies. So it's sort of in that way that I would want to look at Russia as well and ask myself, well, are these kind of characteristics present? And in what sort of, and over the last 100 years, say, for example, how has the manifestation and the combination of such characteristics changed or been present or been absent in the international behavior of the Russian state? Before I sort of look directly at Russia, I just have another sort of methodological issue to raise, and that is the concept of the global north and the global south. Where do we put Eastern Europe? Where do we put China, for that matter? You know, if the
or Japan.
Well, yeah, I would put Japan squarely in the global north.
Yeah,
but if, for example, you know, if the per capita annual income measured in U.S. dollars of a Siberian herdsman is $1,500, of a Russian worker is $7,000. Of a Polish worker is $14,000, but of a West European skilled worker is $28,000 to $35,000. Where are we placing the former communist world? Where are we placing it? I don't know what I don't know China as well, but I think there's looking at the global north and the global south as categories of analysis. We have to accept that there's a certain kind of a continuum, and Russia is astride these two, both in economic and political terms, I would say, and so I'd like to raise that issue as well as I begin. Historically, the Russian imperial state grew over 600 years, from around the 1400s down to the 20th century, and expanded over landmass, quite distinct from the European overseas empires. But this was a particular feature of it. And it stopped expanding when it came up against the other big empires. The British in the Indian subcontinent, the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Central Europe. That was its extent. And within the Russian Empire, there were well over 100 nationalities. The Russian population composing, on average, over the whole 100 years, about 50% of the overall population, but beginning to fall as a proportion of the overall population as the non-Russian peoples exhibited rates of demographic growth that were more rapid, because they were coming into urban, industrial life and modern medical care and so on after the Russians, sort of by a certain timeline. Russian imperial state was, as has already been mentioned, a prison house of nations, as Lenin called it. But by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, that imperial state was in crisis. Not just because it was the weakest of the European imperial states, as I think Lenin said also, the weakest link in the chain of imperial states that snapped in the First World War and unleashed the 1917 revolution. But it also had a crisis because the Russian state was trying to modernize through rapid industrialization and was inviting big amounts of capital from Belgian, German, British, French, and American banks and investors. And so with the growth of a working class, highly concentrated in the biggest enterprises at that time in the world, the Russian state not only saw the growth of a working class, but also saw the influx of the non-Russian peoples from rural life, from peasant occupations, from illiteracy to urban occupations, to industrial jobs, to the acquisition of literacy, and that objectively pressed upon the Russian state and its ability to keep control of a working class that was not only now a working class and had been a peasantry until very recently, and overwhelmingly peasantry, but also a working class that was multinational and that had various national interests within it, not just class interests, if I can use those terms in the most simplistic way. So the Russian state, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the 19th century, and even the First World War, was facing a crisis that was generated by the pressure of peoples for their national liberation as well as for their social liberation. And therefore it was inevitable that the social democratic movement in the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian would have to confront the national question, which was a consequence of the imperial nature of those states in which these peoples lived. And if we look at Chris is studying this, and I've been studying this, and if we look at the organization of the social democratic movement in the Russian Empire, it was organized both along, it was organized and divided and split both along ideological as well as national lines. If we look at principles of party organization, if we look at the programs, the programmatic objectives of the different parties, the Bund, the Polish Socialist Party, the Ukrainian Social Democratic, the Russian Social Democratic, Menshevik and Bolshevik, we find that there's this really intense debate about the nature of Russian imperialism and what comes afterwards. Right? What is the future of humanity after capitalism and imperialism? Will nations flower, and therefore human society will be diverse, most diverse, or is the homogenizing impact of capitalism, which assimilates people into dominant cultures, the way of the future, and that is what socialism will look like? So we had people like Karl Kautsky, who argued that, come socialism, there'll be 7 languages in the world, right? And we Germans will be one of them. Whereas others like Otto Bauer and Renner of the Austro-Marxists argued, no, the emancipation of humanity is also the emancipation of the languages of humanity, of their national cultures, which are hitherto suppressed and oppressed by imperialism. So this is a really rich debate, which really needs to sort of come more and more to the light of day if we're to understand the past that prefigured the Soviet Union. How far am I in? Can you tell me?
Okay.
How many minutes am I? 15, 20? Okay, so I'm going to proceed historically here because I find that the easiest way to sort of try to explain what my points. So if we then sort of look at the history of the Soviet Union and ask ourselves, what is the place of Russia within that Soviet Union? What is does the sort of imperial heritage of the Russian state, which is at the core of the Soviet Union, somehow disappear or fade away? We come up with a lot of contradictory observations. First of all, because the Russian Revolution, as it's called, didn't spread to the West, the Bolsheviks were left to their own resources. And so therefore, if Trotsky wanted to organize a Red Army, he had to take 50,000 Russian officers from the Tsarist army. Otherwise, he couldn't have organized the kind of army that he needed. What did that objectively mean? When Lenin realized in 1921, at the end of the Civil War, that the Soviet state, as he said, is little more than the old Russian bureaucracy anointed with a little Soviet oil, where was he going to find the administrators